Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. As the war in Ethiopia escalates, there's a tsunami of media reports demonizing the Ethiopian government, accusing them of committing every atrocity imaginable. Meanwhile, the TPLF, which started this war, and is openly advocating for a violent coup against a democratically elected government as they advance towards the capital, have been celebrated as noble rebels, and their atrocities whitewashed or ignored entirely. Why is the coverage of this war so one-sided? What's really happening on the ground? And how does it compare to the narrative being presented in the US media? Here to discuss this is Jemal Countess, a US-based photojournalist who was formerly based in Ethiopia and has reported from around the country since the war started. Jemal, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me to discuss this. I just want to give a quick reminder to our viewers. You can listen to every episode of my show Dispatches anywhere you get podcasts. And to our listeners, you can watch every episode of Dispatches on the Breakthrough News YouTube channel. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to get notifications. And you can support all of our great content here at Breakthrough News by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Now, Jemal, with that out of the way, I guess, a good way to start would be maybe to start with how this war started. And, the US media, as you know, has framed it as a war specifically in Tigray that is being conducted by an inexplicably violent government that's fueled by ethnic hatred. But it's much more complicated than that. You've been there since the beginning. You've been both around Tigray as well as Afar and Amhara, all of which have endured war and suffering. So can you give our listeners and viewers an idea, based on your interactions with people around the country and what you've seen, from your perspective, what is this war about?
This war is about the TPLF wanting to return to power. This war is about the fact that they were pushed to the sidelines by an overwhelming majority of Ethiopian voices who wanted to not have them rule over them anymore after 27 years of authoritarian and brutally oppressive rule. So Abiy Ahmed was put into power after they were pushed out of power in 2018. And in essence, they have not been happy with that ever since. The TPLF looted the country of a vast amount of wealth. Conservative estimates were 30 billion. I've heard estimates up to 100 billion recently from various sources. So they enjoyed power. They enjoyed a number of things. They also incorporated a quasi-apartheid system in terms of the how can I say, the social fabric of the country. So it was pro-Tigray, Tigrayans first. The TPLF enjoyed how can I say, dominance in the country for the 27 years they were in power.
And, I actually heard you mention this in another interview that you did that I thought was really interesting, because obviously we know that the TPLF initiated this war with their attack on Ethiopian Northern Command Base. I didn't realize just how serious that attack was. Can you give us an idea of the significance of that attack and how many people were killed?
Okay, so I'd been begging the Ethiopian government for accurate numbers, and then I was made to realize, well, this is wartime and it's an ongoing conflict. So I'm not going to get specifics or the interviews that I requested until things reach a different place. But on the night of November 3rd, 2020, TPLF commandos and regular cadres began to attack people that they had served along for a long period of time in their sleep at night. I do believe I saw reports that the attack began at like 10 o'clock that night on November 3rd and continued for the next 24 hours. During those attacks, they, from what I was told, murdered about 6,000 soldiers. They have committed, within those attacks, they committed atrocities. There are reports and actual survivors, female soldiers who had their breasts cut off. I heard that when they were forced to walk out of Tigray back to Amhara, they were playing games like running them over with tanks and all kinds of things. So these are the things that I've been waiting for the Ethiopian government to grant me access to as a journalist, to have these types of interviews. And we just have to wait for a different phase of the war for me to conduct those interviews. But some of the things that you actually, as a journalist traveling to my cadre in Humera, can see, you pass by two of the bases that were attacked during this attack on 5 different bases. I think everybody has seen the picture of the infamous picture of the tank on the road that was destroyed. That was one of 2 tanks that you passed by on the road to my cadre, that were stolen from the Northern Command and directed towards 2 bases in that region. So I think that what needs to be understood is that with this attack on these 5 bases, the ethnic cleansing operation in Wolkite also began. So you have the situation in my cadre, the massacre that's been so misreported and has had so much propaganda spread about it. Basically, when they planned these attacks, they planned for a full-out takeover of the country. It was a coup. But with that coup comes the ethnic cleansing of Amhara people from the region of Wolkite, which is basically North Gondar. Wolkite has pretty much been a part of Amhara lands for almost 1,000 years. Historians and historical documents can prove that. With the 1991 constitution instituted by the TPLF, they seized Wolkite because Wolkite is a resource-rich region. And it's also a major hub of finance and trade. It's right there next to the Sudanese border, and Humera itself is a major financial hub. So they seized that in 1991, have claimed, oh, well, most of these people who speak Tigrinya prove that it's a region that belongs to Tigray. The fact is, because it's a financial hub and a major trade hub, people were multilingual. So they were Amhara people who spoke Tigrinya. What they also don't report is that they spoke Arabic. There was a sizable Hebrew Jewish population there, and it was just basically like a mecca for business. So they seized Humera as part of seizing Wolkite, and my cadres in there as well. So the attacks on the bases began, and the ethnic cleansing began on the 3rd and 4th, also with the murder of day laborers, culminating in the all-out attacks on my cadre and Humera on the 9th and 10th. So this was all a
Wow.
part of one big major operation.
And you're saying, I mean, the way that you're framing it is like it was a coup from the beginning, an attempted coup, I should say, from the beginning, and a very violent one at that. Is just interesting when you compare to the media bias. I want to get into some of like the specifics of what you've seen, maybe specific incidences and in specific stories that maybe the media has gotten wrong. But first, I think it's important to talk a little bit about why the media might be getting some of this wrong. And I'm talking about the people who are visiting Ethiopia. And you've actually talked about this before, the role of fixers, specifically in Tigray. You've talked about how the TPLF has played a role influencing the narrative of international reporters through fixers. And just as an aside, I report largely from the Middle East, specifically Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. And I've seen a similar thing at play where fixers, because people from outside, international reporters, don't typically know the language, they don't know the where to go, they have to rely on fixers. And who your fixer is crucial to how you end up framing your story. They basically have control completely over what you see, how you see it, what you understand. So can you talk a little bit about how that plays out in Tigray?
Okay, so when in speaking to other journalists, I discovered that people came to Ethiopia with a bias already. The narrative that people are going by is, this heroic rebel group is resisting this onslaught from the Ethiopian government, blah, blah, blah. And nobody has done the actual research and knows the actual background of the TPLF or Ethiopia for the past 30 years. They don't really understand what dynamics were at play. And it's just kind of embarrassing, actually. I'm a photojournalist. I've studied my trade. I've gone through the training and the schooling, but there are people who've had better training and schooling and who actually graduated from school to journalism, and they were making the most amateur of mistakes in terms of this. Nobody came to hear from the Ethiopian government. They went straight to Tigray. They bypassed the Ethiopian government. They refused to do balanced stories. Um, the network of fixers was accessed, I think, before people even got to Ethiopia. So it was like a word of mouth. Hey, use Samson. When you get to Tigray or when you get to Addis, you call Samson. And when you get to Tigray, Samson will pick you up. And Samson is part of a group of fixers who are, more than likely, more or less TPLF intelligentsia. Um, so you have these fixers who basically um, agree way ahead of time on where they're going to take you, what they want you to see, and what narratives they're going to tell you. Where we were staying at the Northern Star Hotel, like most of the journalists who were in Mekelle when I was there, we were met or greeted with a lobby full of people. Now, granted, because of the circumstances and the curfew and all of these kind of things, everybody clusters around hotels to use the Wi-Fi.
Mhm.
So it's like I actually went to another hotel to use Wi-Fi because my Wi-Fi went down for a minute and I couldn't transmit pictures. So all of these hotels have people in them using the Wi-Fi. Um, the Northern Star Hotel was no exception, but there was a willingness for people to engage you in conversation to tell you stories, and these stories all had the same familiar tone, and they repeated some of the same facts, give or take. This town was destroyed by fire. This town was destroyed by white phosphorus. 500 homes were destroyed. 600 homes were destroyed. Um, but they all agreed on these narratives. I engaged one fixer in particular who I just had a heart to heart conversation with about politics. And he was dead set on the storyline. We are surrounded by enemies. The US and Europe will back us, will help us survive this. And, we just need to succeed. He even went as far to tell me that he took his team, sorry, he took France
No worries.
24 to the center of Mekelle to interview a group of boys who happened to be playing games, and they all talked about succession. Um, and I think that there are a few journalists who have come to Ethiopia who've kind of done the work, but not enough, not enough. There are also moves that point to the fact that a lot of these people are not just influenced by the TPLF, but are in bed with the TPLF and who are being fed directly by Getachew Reda and other TPLF sources for their information. And this comes from, this network that was set up way beforehand, many years ago, by Getachew Reda and Simone Berakat, um, that basically created a ring of journalists that they would use, the TPLF would use to disseminate their information. And it also involved utilizing the top 25 NGOs and humanitarian aid organizations in Ethiopia and creating rings of information or information dissemination.
Wow. That's actually very smart, I guess, in this situation for them. But it's been quite shocking to see the disparity between what someone like yourself is saying versus what almost like the entire
Western media
media, yeah,
apparatus, yeah.
the entire Western. I mean, it's like there's no difference, and they all just kind of cover the same stories and repeat the same topics. And one thing I've noticed that's quite striking, as I'm sure you have, is they've been obsessively focused on Tigray to the detriment of like everywhere else. So Tigray is the epicenter of this war. And I know it is, that's where, the war is bad there. I'm not denying that. But like left out of that is the fact that there's these TPLF offensives in Amhara and Afar. So can you talk a little bit about the suffering there that you've witnessed as a result of these TPLF offensives, and maybe walk us through some specific places that you've been recently as this war has escalated against these areas?
Okay, so I've been to, I think, about 6 different IDP camps. The thing about that I should mention is that there are IDPs outside of these camps. So IDPs, for people who don't know, are internally displaced people. So I've been to 2 camps in North Gondar, actually, yeah, 2 camps in North Gondar, one in Gondar, two in Gondar proper, and then Kombucha and Desi, which are to the east. But Debark, I went to Chena, which is the site of a massacre that killed 207 Amhara people during which was initiated during a mass on a Holy Day celebration at a church, Chena Tekla Hamaynat. I've been to Zanzilima, I've been to Enebet. Bahar Dar itself is now officially like a large IDP camp. It's a major city in the Amhara region next to Lake Tana or on Lake Tana. And actually, a lot of IDPs from Lalibela in particular have come to Bahar Dar because of its proximity to Lalibela. Um, the suffering in a lot of the established camps is kind of unparalleled. Lack of plumbing, lack of supplies, foodstuffs coming mainly from donations from local charities, people with untreated trauma. I mean, that's something that's really downplayed is the amount of trauma and suffering that exist within these displaced people's communities. So, we take for granted healthcare, mental health care. It's non-existent there. It's non-existent. And you have people who have seen death, people who've seen suffering, people who've been uprooted from their homes, um, sometimes in the middle of the night or just in rapid fashion, who have had to leave their homes and who are traumatized behind that. They don't know where they're going to return to. They're people who have not seen their loved ones in several months because they got separated. So these camps are overcrowded. They are primarily repurposed schools or industrial sites, some of which are never meant for human occupation. I mean, like overnight kind of things. So you're talking about a camp at like Zanzilima, which was an industrial park for retail for businesses, and they're just basically like huge warehouses. Um, and there's probably like officially like maybe 10 bathrooms for this huge complex. Um, but because you now have 5,000 plus IDPs there, they dug trenches or they dug a trench and built 40 stalls over this trench. And these 40 stalls now serve as the bathrooms for 5,000 plus people. They're not free flowing plumbing kind of trenches. It's just like stagnant feces in a trench that people have to use day in and day out. Um, you know, Nairobi fly, which was just common in Bahar Dar because of the temperature and the location, which some people are familiar with and as being a problem in that region during certain months, um, made for a lot of headaches for a lot of people, especially the children, the younger people who um, didn't realize what they were dealing with, and these Nairobi flies were wreaking havoc on young people and adults alike. Um, then it's just a kind of general despair.
Mhm.
Um, and like I said, foodstuffs are lacking. Um, hygiene, access to running water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yeah, and I recall you noting that I think that you had tweeted about this, but there was a few camps that a few IDP camps that you weren't able to access because of people inside of them who didn't want a certain narrative to get out. I don't know if I have that wrong, but is it difficult to access the IDP camps you want because of various players in this war?
well, I'll say this: you can access the IDP camps, especially if you arrange ahead of time.
Hmm.
Now that this particular story we're going to discuss is kind of more open and exposed, I think you will have an easier time accessing it. By and large, I didn't have problems because there's a certain protocol that I utilize to visit these camps, and it's all about complete respect and concern for the people that I want to engage and interview. But the TPLF has infiltrated large numbers of IDP camps, and they've infiltrated these camps for the sole purpose of quieting, silencing people. In Kombucha and Dese, more so in Dese, these IDP camps were infiltrated, and people were having their families threatened. So a lot of the IDPs in Dese were a little hesitant to talk because it's like the TPLF were threatening their families back in Raya Kobo in these regions that are now occupied, saying, if you talk, we'll kill your families. We will take it out on them. But as we saw with the recent offenses, when Dese fell because there were TPLF operatives who had been in the region for a long time, people who had lived there, Tigrayans, but who were aligned with the TPLF and who had secretly armed themselves, and who, in a Tet Offensive style maneuver, decided that, okay, the TPLF is nearby, we're going to strike out and kill Amhara. So a lot of people were caught off guard by the sleepers, as I call them, who came out of the shadows and basically assisted the TPLF when they came close to or arrived in Desi.
Yeah. The media, I just want to note the media, I mean, as you've seen, has made a really big deal about the fact that the government in Addis is basically has this crackdown that's targeting ethnic Tigrayans that they believe might be sympathizers with the TPLF. And this is kind of, not to excuse that, but this is essentially what's missing from that coverage is what you're talking about. And it reminds me actually a lot of the Middle East with ISIS. When there would be sleeper cells in various areas that would collaborate with ISIS when they would come and take over an area. And what you have here that you're describing is ethnic Tigrayans in these particular places where the TPLF has taken over that are a part of the TPLF and essentially help them take over the area and turn on their neighbors, which is horrible. So this doesn't surprise me at all. But yeah, can you, I guess, discuss your thoughts on all of that, which you were already getting into? I just wanted to give people, I guess, some background.
When I lived in, when we lived in Addis, I lived in Addis during the last years of the TPLF and in the first years of Abiy's Abiy's power. And when Abiy came to power, he graciously said, you know what, I'm not going to pursue you, as in the TPLF leaders. I'm not going to put you in jail. We know what you've done to this country. Just go back to Tigray and live your lives. That's essentially what he said. And what's missing from the media narrative is his exchanges with the TPLF prior to this conflict. What's also missing from the media narratives are these ridiculous incidences that we witnessed in Addis when the TPLF was going back to Mekelle peacefully. The police were intercepting tanker trucks full of money. I mean, like oil tanker trucks full of money. And I don't mean single cab. I mean like double cab tanker trucks full of Ethiopian birr and American dollars. Even I lived in an apartment complex in Arat Kilo, and I had a lot of ethnic Tigrayans as my neighbors, no problems, really kind people. My landlord was actually ethnic Tigrayan, and he was, like I've said before, a very, very sweet man. But a couple weeks after we had left Addis Ababa to come back to the States, they found an industrial pallet full of money under a bridge in my neighborhood. They were always intercepting cars full of money. There were all kind of things going back to Tigray. So I say that to say that fast forward to now, the media has failed to report the fact that they closed down a lot of hotels in Addis Ababa. And a lot of these hotels were found to be funneling money back to the TPLF. There was one hotel in particular that was found to have a large cache of weapons, like rooms full of Kalashnikovs, waiting for the time when these weapons will be utilized to overthrow the government. The media is not reporting stories like this. The media is not reporting these local stories, because they're not interested. It doesn't feed their narrative. But B, they just don't care to, you know. And it's like whether it's the language barrier, which is something else that needs to be discussed, um, or whatever. It's like these are little bits of the story that are crucial to people understanding that you have armed active sleepers throughout the country, and these moves are basically made to protect themselves, to protect the Ethiopian people.
Yeah, that's like a huge story to ignore. And then another thing that has been pretty wild is, we've heard these accusations of the TPLF using child soldiers. And it was really shocking when the New York Times published that photo story that I know you're aware of, where it was clearly children holding weapons, and they referred to them as a ragtag TPLF rebel force. So, in your time in Ethiopia covering this conflict, have you seen any evidence of the use of child soldiers?
I haven't seen firsthand Tigrayan child soldiers. What I
Mhm.
did see when I went to an IDP camp at Enabet was young Amhara boys. I interviewed a child who was 10 years old. And then all of a sudden, there was this group of 10 to 14-year-olds, and then 10 to 16-year-olds who had left Sokoto, one of the towns that the TPLF invaded, because they wanted to escape forced conscription. So what was happening is the TPLF was taking young Amhara boys, um, basically kidnapping them, giving them minimal training, and forcing them to walk out in front of their advancing troops as human shields. Excuse me, some holding weapons, fake weapons, some carrying nothing at all. Um, One of the things that is downplayed again by the Western media, as they have sought to demonize the Amhara and the Amhara troops and the Amhara special forces and the ENDF. The story that's never been told is that initially the ENDF suffered horrific losses because they refused to fire on children. They saw and recognized young children. They did not want to fire on children. Many of these people are of the Orthodox faith and did not believe in killing children. To them, killing children is a great sin. So what happens is you see a child in the battlefield and you stutter, you freeze, and then the advancing troops behind those children pick you off. So it's a psychological move as well, using child soldiers. But I've not seen myself Tigrayan child soldiers. I've just seen the child soldiers on the Amhara side, or the attempted, or the escapees who refused, and who left before they could be conscripted.
Jesus, so you're talking actually what you're saying is actually worse than just using child soldiers. It's using children as human shields.
Yeah.
No question. But you mentioned the issue of you keep going back to the issue of like bigotry towards the Amhara, and it sounds like what you're saying is the Western press is actually spreading that kind of bigotry in their own reporting because they're getting their sort of talking points from the TPLF activists.
Yes, exactly. And they don't even know what an Amhara is, to be honest with you. I've seen, I live here in DC, and I've seen people even talk about, oh, these brutal Amhara militia, these Amhara this, Amhara that. And it's just really nauseating because I'm just like, can you spell Amhara? You know?
And that goes
And
back to sorry, go ahead, please
no, no,
continue.
no. I'll just ramble on about that. It's just deeply infuriating, you know?
Understandably so. And I guess that goes back to the issue you mentioned too of perhaps, this goes back to sort of the parachute journalism, right?
Hmm.
Where people who've never covered an area of the world, a specific country, a specific place, just kind of come in for the first time for a couple weeks, a few days. And like we talked about with the whole fixer situation, they're very influenced by that. They already have sort of they're already biased in various ways. They don't understand the language. Do you think, one of the biggest barriers? Because there are so many languages in Ethiopia. I know people speak Amharic mostly, but there
Hmm.
are other languages as well. So what can you, I guess, say about the barriers that people might have with the issue of language?
Well, I mean, even myself, when I went to my cadre in Chagny, I had a thoroughly educated translator. Actually, when I went to Chagny, when I went to my cadre, I had two translators. Actually, and I was taking my recordings and sending them back to the States for just a triple check verification. Otherwise, I use a translator when I was working in the camps, because there were several groups of people from the Ago peoples, which are a group underneath of the Amhara ethnicity. So they spoke Agu. So I had an Amharic translator and an Agu translator. I know I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that word, so everybody forgive me for that. But one of the families that I took to a local doctor for medical treatment from Nairobi fly exposure, they were Agu. So I've got mom, her kids who are suffering with this condition. I've got the camp administrator who speaks Agu, and then I've got the camp administrator or my fixer who is speaking Amharic. So it's just, you're thorough, you listen, you record, and you just go over it and you make sure you got it right. What I've noticed ridiculously so is that a lot of these journalists are using Google Translate. I don't know, you should just play a game one day and look at how badly Google Translate translates Amharic. It's insane. And some people are actually trying to report credible news stories using that. Um,
Jesus.
and I just shake my head again. I just don't know. I mean, when I was coming up, if I had two captions wrong in a sentence, my editor would ream me out. This is just for a simple photo caption. You
Yeah.
have people reporting full-fledged stories whose stories are just brutal, 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 brutal attempts at God knows what. I just, I try to keep my composure, but I can't stand it. I really can't stand it. And it's just like, hire two fixers. I mean, hire two translators. Respect
Right.
the country enough to know um, that you need to really be sure of what people are saying. And especially in a sensitive area like this, especially in a conflict like this.
Yeah, that
You
has
know?
so many implications for an entire region of the world.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you if you have anything that you can tell us about what you understand about the issues. Well, two issues. There's the issue of looting, which I mean is common in war. Like it
Hmm.
happens in every war. Militias loot.
Hmm.
But I'm curious what you've seen around the issue of looting. And then on top of that, the issue of the presence of foreign fighters or what we might call mercenaries participating in this war. And I know there's people who you can maybe call foreign fighters from on both sides here. Like I know the Eritreans have been fighting with the Ethiopian federal forces, but I haven't seen any coverage of foreign fighters who may be fighting with the TPLF. So what can you tell us about that?
Um, I have been hearing things. Now, see, I don't like to really necessarily repeat something until I've either seen it myself or verified it. But I keep seeing these pictures online with a soldier in blue, a blue kind of uniform, with Kevlar or with armor, um, who obviously is not Ethiopian. He is very much lighter skinned, and
Mhm.
some people say he's Egyptian. I'm like, well, he doesn't even look Egyptian. He looks European, you know.
Oh, okay.
Um, but I've heard this, and I've been hearing this, and Abiy Ahmed made a statement a few weeks ago saying that they had recovered the bodies and captured foreign fighters in the fight for Dese and then actually in Wallo. Um, like I said, I honestly, my policy is I don't touch it unless I can prove it. You know,
Fair enough. Yeah.
But I've been hearing that for a long time. One of the things I will say, though, now that we're coming up on the anniversary of the real brutal massacre in Benishangul Gums, is that I've had survivors of those medical massacres tell me about the involvement of Egypt and Sudan in supplying and coordinating the Gooms and the OLF in that region. They've talked about the Benishangul Gooms fighters killing and warring in Metakol and Benishangul Gooms. If they're wounded, going back to their camps in Sudan and receiving free medical treatment and being allowed to heal and recover and go back into the fight in Ethiopia. And these camps are supplied and cared for and funded by the Egyptian government. So,
Well, that wouldn't surprise me considering, and again, if I'm just speculating here, considering the fact that the Egyptian government has said they would be willing to go to war over the issue of the Ethiopian dam, it wouldn't surprise me if they were playing some sort of role. obviously the TPLF has to be getting help from outside in some capacity. And then, of course, there's the role of Sudan, which is still a bit murky as well. But you do have these refugee camps that are sprawling up in Sudan, full of mostly people from Tigray. And there seems to be a bit of a network, an activist network there that's been involved in pushing certain stories and narratives as well, which reminds me of so many other wars in the Middle East where, neighboring countries become involved in different ways, and refugee camps that sprawl up become the center of sort of planning various operations. But what can you tell? I mean, have you visited Sudan at all in the context of this war? No. Okay.
No. I mean, if I can say, it's very interesting. When I did the work in my cadre in Humera, there is a major military checkpoint at the juncture, because basically you're on the road to my cadre, and it's a T. You get to a T junction. My cadre is to the left, and Humera is to the right, and it's basically like an armed. Or it's like I said, it's a military checkpoint with tanks and what have you, and the road to my cadre actually goes straight to Sudan. And when I was there, I saw refugees flowing freely that passed their ID checks that were just leaving to go to Sudan. When I get to my cadre, all of my interviewees tell me that after the killers had finished in Humera and my cadre, they either went back to Mekelle or they went to Sudan, to the refugee camps. And I remember early on when I started to see the pictures of these refugee camps, after the reporting on my cadre, the early local reporting, you see the pictures. If you go back and you see the pictures of the young men holding their plates in front of their faces in the refugee camps in Sudan. And the reports were that there's a large number of young, able-bodied men who came into the refugee camps from Ethiopia, who came without families, or they say they were separated from their families. And these were actually the members of the Samri youth group and TPLF cadre who had escaped from the killing in my cadre in Humera, and who basically placed themselves in Sudan amongst actual refugees, and basically stayed there. I have accounts of people who fled from my cadre after the massacre, who went to Sudan, to the refugee camps, and then were chased out of the refugee camps by the killers, people who had killed their friends and family, who were threatening them in the camps. So, and once again, thousands of Ethiopian voices echoed this before I got to my cadre, and the Western media just shut it down, completely shut it down. And I'll say that it was intentional, because I'll go back to the very beginning. This picture of this tank that I haven't published it yet, but every other media outlet has published this tank outside of the Dancha military base that was destroyed. It's on the road to my cadre in Humera. There's only one road into my cadre. So obviously people went to my cadre in Humera to do some type of reporting, but they chose a different narrative, Wow. So what you're looking at is large numbers, and even Getachew Reda, I think it was Getachew Reda and Deborah Sion alluded to the fact that we have 30,000 unarmed fighters in Sudan ready to join the fight. Then when they got called on it, they said, no, we have 30,000 unarmed patriots who are ready to join the fight. So they just kind of played themselves with that. But then what also the Western media does not report is the 2 or 3 incidences in Humera where there were columns of soldiers coming back into Ethiopia from Sudan that basically got taken out because they were basically trying to come in, dig up the weapons that they had buried, and join the fight. So there's a lot that the Western media has left out that would completely.
These are good stories too. These are like pretty explosive stories. Like, why would you, as a journalist, why would you want to ignore that? Of course, unless you have some sort of like agenda, or stake in this war in some way. Because what you're talking about are stories that any journalist should want to jump on. I wanted to ask about the psychological warfare element here because, the US media a few weeks ago we all saw was promoting this narrative about how the TPLF was just outside Addis when they were actually like 200 miles away, which
Yeah.
200 or 300 kilometers, I think it was.
Yeah.
But
Mm-hmm.
that's far. That
Yeah.
is not close.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you have the US embassy like repeatedly warning Americans in Ethiopia to leave now, like they've done it like several times, over a dozen times, I think, and making this bizarre comparison to Afghanistan, saying, we're not going to do a military style evacuation like in Afghanistan. And now you have this bizarre advisory that came out from the Federal Aviation Administration. And I actually want to read from this Washington Post article. I know that you saw this, so they say the FAA advisory notes no reports of disruptions at the Bull International Airport and, quote, no indication of intent to civil aviation, no indication of an intent to threaten civil aviation. But it says the risk to approaching and departing planes could increase if the Tigray fighters encircle the capital. The Tigray fighters, quote, likely possess a variety of anti-aircraft capable weapons, including rocket-propelled grenades, anti-tank weapons, low-caliber anti-aircraft artillery, and man-pads, which could reach up to 25,000 feet above ground. That's what the FAA advisory from the U.S. says. Mm-hmm. So this kind of seemed to me like an attempt to attack the Ethiopian Airlines, which is like the most prestigious airline in Africa, that CNN tried to like get sanctioned with this really botched report about them supposedly transporting weapons. And I also found it kind of weird that like the Federal Aviation Administration would warn that the TPLF might shoot down a commercial airliner when like the US is essentially advocating for the TPLF. Like, why are you supporting this group if they might shoot down a commercial airliner? But anyways, that's all to say, like, what's your take on the reason behind these dire warnings? Is there any truth here? Like, is Addis about to fall to the TPLF, or is there something more happening?
Every report, mind you, I still have family in Ethiopia, and I have a lot of friends in Ethiopia. I have journalist friends, local journalist friends who are in Ethiopia. And no, according to them, Addis is not about to fall. No, Addis is not about to fall to the OLF Sheni, which is, I think, what people are trying to really stir up and play off of. And actually, the reports that I'm getting is that the TPLF are being battered in that approach, that I'll call it that kind of northeastern approach to Addis. I'm just like kind of looking like, okay, well, this is so obviously now like the most ridiculous propaganda. I have to say that, and I noticed this on my last flight, and I always just kind of take note of this. For anybody who's not aware, most of the approaches to Addis Ababa have you flying over Tigray. I mean, you actually, if I remember the map correctly, you pass over Aksum, you pass over Eritrea, and you pass over Tigray. You pass over Aksum on approach to Addis Ababa when you're flying from Europe. Actually, when you're flying from anywhere west, it's that northern approach. And even when you're coming in from Dubai, you kind of do a similar path where you fly over another part of Tigray closer to Mekelle. So manpads and these kind of warnings are just like, okay, all right, this I don't know. This is like becoming a clown show now. Yeah. So it's just like one of the things that all of this propaganda is meant to do is take advantage of the people who don't have any awareness of the region or the situation on the ground. So it's meant to just scare the bejeebies out of people. So then now what are you going to do? You're going to have a walkout from Lufthansa because these pilots don't want to fly into the region. You're going to have a, blah, blah, blah. And so it's ridiculous. It's embarrassing. It's completely embarrassing. I was commenting to a colleague of mine yesterday on Capitol Hill, like, I'm watching people's credibility and careers like go up in flames because they have they're repeating TPLF propaganda. The TPLF has a habit of projecting the most ridiculous propaganda, the most sensational propaganda. And then because we've taken this posture with Africa in the West, where we really don't know Africa anymore, if we ever knew it at all, so we're just believing everything the TPLF said. So it's just like, some of those early pieces that came out about the war, I mean, I cringed, and I wrote to a couple of media organizations that I knew that were doing the most egregious reporting. I'm just like, no, this is not the situation. And they ignored me. So at this stage, I'm just like, I read it and I'm just like,
Throwing your
okay,
arms up in
whatever.
the air, like, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. It's
I wanted to oh, sorry, go ahead, go ahead.
no, no, no. It's just bad. It's just bad. It's
Yeah.
intentional. They're trying to crush Ethiopia any way they can financially. They're trying to crush the reputation of Ethiopian Airlines. But what they're doing is underestimating African resolve and Eastern resolve. They're underestimating the rest of the globe's resolve to actually see through this conflict and see through the propaganda and support Ethiopia.
Yeah, especially the surrounding countries. Like, I think they thought Kenya would get on board, and Kenya hasn't gotten on board. And
Mm-mm.
anyways, I wanted to ask about another aspect of this, which is the situation with the UN. I don't know how much you know about the UN staffers, but we all know, the Ethiopian government has repeatedly expressed frustration with what they say is a biased UN staff, and they've expelled some senior UN staffers. So, from your time reporting in Ethiopia, I'm not sure if you've interacted with people in the UN, but do you see the UN as behaving in a biased way? And if so, why do you think that is?
Uh, well, forgive me for being long-winded about this.
Please.
I've had my UN credential for almost 13 years now, and
Oh,
the protocol for a journalist who wants to cover any UN activities in a region is to reach out to that particular region and request access. So when I wanted to cover something UN related in South Africa, I'll call or I'll write to Malu, media relations, and they'll connect me with the person in that region, and I write to that person, and they say, sure, come on down and do X, Y, and Z, you know? And this is just standard. So when I went to Mekelle, I wrote to my person, my contact at the UN. They're like, great to hear from you, haven't seen you in a while. Here's who you want to contact in regards to UNHCR operations in Mekelle. Um, she gave me 5 names, and we were all CC'd on the same email. Um, One person who I tried to reach out to before she responded, here's the person you want to contact about Mekelle. I wrote to this person 3 times. I texted him, and finally I get an email from him, and we have this exchange, and he's basically like, well, there's no UNHCR operations in Mekelle. I work for OCHA. And, I will talk to my colleagues and see if they want to accept your offer for coverage of our humanitarian efforts in Mekelle. And I'm like, well, this is not an offer. This is standard. It's like you're doing something to help the people of Mekelle, the people of Tigray. The world needs to know what you're doing to help the people of Tigray. And never
right.
heard from this guy again. Um, Same thing. I chucked it up to, okay, whatever. All right. Um, I came back to the Amhara region a couple months later. I reached out to my UN contact person again. She was like, okay, well, here's the same person. I'm like, this guy didn't really want to help me in Mekelle. She was like, really? Why not? I thought they'd want media coverage. And I'm just like, no, they didn't. So um, when I'm in Mekelle the day after that initial conversation, I go to an IDP camp, and what do I see? A big UNHCR tent, basically like about half a mile from my hotel within this IDP camp. Um, all of that to say is there has been a long known fact, long standing fact that a lot of the Ethiopians that you see working in the UN structure are Tigrayan and TPLF
I see.
loyalists, you know?
Mm,
So like when you go to the campus in Addis Ababa, it's I don't want to say it's all Tigrayan, but it's all Tigrayan for the most part. From the guards to everybody you interact with in every department. So it's just like they run it.
yeah.
And I think all of the whistleblower feedback and everything that you've
Mhm,
heard from people who have come out, it's like, once again, these people were put in place to control the narrative, to control the resources and access for the TPLF, for 100 years, as Mellis put it,
mhm.
you know? So yeah, there is a problem. There is a problem. I mean, I probably won't have a UN credential after this, but you know, it
Well,
is what it is. You know.
I mean, that makes perfect sense. And like, you're not going to be in power for 30 years and not try to dominate everything like that. It actually, it would be weird if they hadn't done that, I suppose, given how they operated when they were in charge. I wanted to ask you about the issue of aid, um, which is kind of, tangential to what you were talking about. Despite all this evidence, right, about aid trucks going missing at the hands of the TPLF looting USAID warehouses, which the USAID came out and said happened, of aid organizations noting that the fighting is the primary obstacle to delivering aid. The media is still saying in almost every single article that I read about the war in Ethiopia, you still see this blame placed on the Ethiopian government for blockading Tigray, for blocking aid across the country, across various regions. So, what do you see as the primary obstacle to the movement of humanitarian aid?
The TPLF. That's it. That's
Simple enough.
exactly it. It's just the TPLF, and it's almost to the point where I just want to stop reading people's publications. I canceled my subscription to the Times.
Wow.
And I mean, I know it said, that $20 a month is not going to prove anything. But I'm done. I'm so done because, I've lived there. I've experienced, both regimes. And I've been able to see through everything that's happened. And then to see people come in and make, the most elementary mistakes has just convinced me that it's not accidental anymore. It's intentional. This is,
Yeah.
as I've called it, this is 21st century Patrice Lumumba style effort to change regime.
Yeah.
It's just that you're not openly, taking part in somebody's assassination per se. But it's intentional. The TPLF is blocking aid. The TPLF is the reason why there's no aid getting through. I will say that, on the contrary, all of these humanitarian aid organizations are looking at over 1 million IDPs in Amhara and Afar. And every camp I've gone to, I've only seen local charities and local players in the Orthodox Church feeding people. I haven't seen USAID in any of the camps I've been to. I haven't seen Catholic Relief Charities in any of the camps I've been to. I haven't seen IRC in any of the camps I've been to. I haven't seen any of that. You know, I haven't seen any of that. And I basically can point to every camp and say, okay, these stacks of wheat flour came from the Amhara Emergency Fund. These mattresses on the ground for these pregnant women who are confined 28 to a room, they came from the Amhara Emergency Fund, or they came from the Orthodox Church. But you see, how many NGOs do we see active in Tigray?
Like, yeah, that's pretty much their primary concern
Yeah.
is Tigray. And you actually don't hear at all about these other places. That's shocking that they're not even servicing or doing anything to help people in these other areas. And it's not like it's just a few thousand people. It's a significant number of people, as you've mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you about, the general sentiment about the conflict on the ground. Obviously, Ethiopians are not a monolith, but it does seem like, in the US media narrative, you get this idea that the Ethiopian government's evil, needs to go because they're committing genocide, and everyone pretty much agrees with that. But the images of rallies that you see in Ethiopia suggest something very different. And of course, the Ethiopian diaspora, especially in the US, has been very vocal about where they stand. So, what is your perception of how Ethiopians generally feel about this conflict?
Let me try to frame it this way. Irregardless of some of our political thoughts, in the US, as a New Yorker, I woke up on September 12th, 2001, with a certain feeling. And I was just like, I can't curse. I'm sorry. I won't curse. So this is a family show. But ultimately, when the dust settled, a month later, I'd lost 7 firefighters from the Bowery Firehouse around the corner from my job. To one friend and one of my former employees who worked at the company I worked at, who was just identified by the DNA material in his high school ring, crushed high school ring. That's the only thing they found of him. So, we all had a sense of resolve. What the
Hmm.
Western media um, continues to basically screw up with is the fact that every Ethiopian knows about the Northern Command attacks, the 5 bases, not one base, but the 5 bases. They also know that my cadre was a part of this. My cadre was, this planned ethnic cleansing was a part of this military campaign, which was ultimately a coup attempt. Um, they also know about the sleeper cells. They also are, survivors of the 27-year rule of the TPLF. So basically, people are fighting for their lives, against a force that basically has always wanted to kind of dominate and or destroy parts of the country. And they're reacting to that, So
Yeah.
when you see, like, I was really furious on November 3rd, actually November 4th, because I saw somebody take a photo from AFP and saying Ethiopians rally, to honor the start of the war. I'm like, no, assholes. These people are memorializing the deaths of thousands of soldiers in Ethiopia in the Northern Command. And
Yeah.
because they stick with this narrative of Abiy went in on November 4th to start the war. No, Abiy responded to an attack on November 3rd where people had their throats slit in their sleep, you know?
It's
So,
not that difficult to understand.
yeah, I mean, it's that like this Amhara nationalism kind of thing. And I'm just like, you guys are, once again, I can't curse. I mean, you guys are just ridiculous. You're really ridiculous. And it's painful. And that's why I believe now it's intentional, completely intentional.
I want to ask you about, I just have a couple more questions here, and I do
Okay.
appreciate your time. But I do want to ask you about the issue of the Oromo Liberation Army. You don't have to go like into too much detail, but there's been some, attempt in the media to play this as like, oh, now the TPLF has been joined by this other group, and they're going to join together out of like solidarity to take down this big bad, government. What's actually the case of what's happening here? Because I know the Oromo issue is separate from the Tigrayan issue, but at the same time, they have joined forces.
Well, the original plan, the way it was explained to me, the original plan of November 4th was that the TPLF would attack from the north and the Oromo
Oh.
Liberation Army in front, I just call them front, would attack from the south. And they basically would topple the government, and then reinstate the TPLF. The relationship between the OLF and the TPLF has been murky. People have recounted to me that the TPLF have basically sought to use the OLF, but they don't respect the OLF. They're just like, pawns to them. So, and I'm not going to really speak on it heavily because I'm just not really that sure beyond,
Fair enough.
just exactly what is transpired before me. But yeah, these guys, I don't know about the depth of that relationship. I know that people are concerned about the OLF because
Mhm.
they have amassed arms. They do have some capacity to wage war, but they're infuriated by the OLF at the same time because the OLF so far has just been massacring women and children. When we talk about the atrocities in Ataye and other parts of the Oromia region towards Amhara, it's basically been psychological, like the most brutal psychological warfare and acts and atrocities that you could imagine, specifically targeting children,
That's
specifically targeting
horrible.
women, things, playing games by seeing how many strikes to the head before you can see a child's brains come out of its head.
Jesus.
You know,
Oh, wow.
this is the OLF trademark. And in terms of the OLF, in regards to how they've worked with the Gooms in Beni Shungle, the acts of cannibalism by the Gooms, the atrocities of basically dissecting people and eating their livers. You know,
Wow. Okay.
um, yeah, people have thought that that's too fantastic, but the witnesses that I interviewed in Chagny that escaped from medical and the region, they just basically talked about how, some women couldn't bury their husbands because all they had were just pieces, because their bodies had been so brutally dismembered and just, parts of it eaten, parts of it was whatever,
It's just like shocking that this is what happens when there's a war and there's so many people who are cheering it on, and that makes it even more disgusting that there are people who are cheering it on. I just, I don't think you have an answer to this. I don't think anyone does, because we don't really know. But US policy on this situation has been so chaotic and ridiculous and one-sided, but also confused. I'm just curious, from your vantage point, what is happening here? Why do you think the US is being so one-sided and is really helping to encourage this conflict to continue with their actions?
Lapdog politics. The TPLF were basically their lapdogs in the Horn of Africa. I've even read a statement where Samantha Power said that, things were so peaceful and calm and they worked so well under the TPLF. And I'm like, yeah, while the TPLF, sterilized 54,000 Amhara women, while the TPLF disappeared 2 million Amhara, which are still missing. Before the war, I mean, we were finding effectively, and I'll say we as a society, I'm not Ethiopian, but we were finding mass graves in Walkite where they had been disappearing people for years and the crimes were just being discovered. And this was before my Khadra. Kind of similar to like how in South Africa, every now and then you'll find somebody's body way out in the countryside that the police disappeared, but this is just on a larger scale. So, the US has just wanted somebody in place that they could trust. There's the whole China issue and countering China's advances in the region. I think it's interesting. I'm curious to see how it's going to play out, but that, Russia and Ethiopia religiously had a relationship that goes back centuries because, Russian Orthodox priests used to train in Ethiopia or study in Ethiopia towards as a work towards becoming priest. I'd be curious to see how that, plays out in any way, shape, or form. I'm not saying it will. But U.S. foreign policy has always been about command and control. Put a lapdog in place. He controls the region. We prop him up, and that's that. There are other kind of issues that people just have with Ethiopia psychologically. It's like it's never been colonized. I kind of got the feeling that people are just tired of hearing that. These people are so proud. They've never been colonized. So we need to show them a good lesson.
We got to colonize them, I guess. Yeah. To really show them who's boss. Jeez.
Yeah. And then there's this other thing where, and this is another tangent, another conversation. Why is the oldest Christian nation on the planet subject for all of your missionaries? It's like there have been times I've been on a flight with like 30 or 40 missionaries going to Ethiopia, none of whom speak Amharic, none of whom know linguistics well enough to translate a Bible from English into Oromifa or Amharic or Tigrinya, but they're going there to convert the oldest Christian nation people to Jesus Christ, and I'm just like, it's just, I don't get it. There's so many layers to this intervention and U.S. posture towards Ethiopia. It's mind-boggling,
Yeah. What do you think, Jemal, like, I guess to end on, what do you think that those who are watching, particularly Americans, need to understand about this conflict if there's one or two things they take away from this conversation?
They need to understand that the regime that ruled Ethiopia for 27 years was a brutal, authoritarian, repressive regime that utilized U.S. support to basically control its own people. Ghazi snipers were trained by U.S. gunnies. Those snipers were crucial in the crackdowns that occurred in Oromia, and more particularly in Amhara during the 2016-2017 protest. we've utilized that aid. I mean, there's a picture. Somebody I interviewed showed me a picture, or talked to me about a picture, excuse me, in the Martyrs Museum in Tigray, of a woman, a Caucasian woman, giving over 20 SUVs to the TPLF, just as a gift. The U.S. has had this relationship with the TPLF. The U.S. wants to continue this lapdog relationship, and they're doing their best to prop up this regime that basically was a terror to the whole population of Ethiopia.
Well
And
said.
yeah. I mean, I could go on, but I know we have time constraints.
Well, I guess the last thing I would want to ask you is, where can people follow your excellent work?
I utilize 2 Instagram pages, but primarily Jemal Countess Photography on Instagram, and Jemal Countess. I do contract work for Getty Images and Redux Pictures, and I'm on Twitter. So
Thank you so much, Jemal, for coming on and breaking all this down for us. I really appreciate it.
thanks for having me.